For 6 months, I had been living a lie, forcing a smile while my world quietly crumbled beneath me. It started with little things I told myself I was imagining. Greg, my husband, was always a smooth talker, a man who could turn any situation in his favor with a well-placed joke or a charming grin. At first, I believed him. I wanted to believe him. After all, we had built a life together. Why would I question that? But doubts have a way of creeping in, like cracks in a wall, small at first until they splinter into something undeniable. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday night. Greg had come home late, much later than usual. He claimed it was a client meeting, but something about his story didn't sit right. His tie was loosened, his shirt slightly wrinkled, and worst of all, he smelled of a perfume I didn't own. My stomach twisted, but I swallowed my suspicion, telling myself I was overreacting. The next morning, I checked our credit card statement, a habit I had never felt the need to indulge in before. That's when I saw it charges at a restaurant I had never been to, one of the finest in town. Still, I hesitated. Confronting Greg without evidence would be pointless. He was the type to turn a conversation around, making me question my own logic until I was the one apologizing. So I waited and watched. The second crack came a week later, hidden in a pile of mail on the kitchen counter. A receipt for a down payment on a luxury car. My heart pounded as I read the details. The car was extravagant, far beyond what Greg and I had discussed when we talked about finances. But what sent chills down my spine was the fact that my name wasn't anywhere on the paperwork. That night, I brought it up carefully, masking my suspicion with feigned curiosity. "Greg, did you buy a new car?" I asked, my voice light. He barely looked up from his phone. Oh, that. It's a client thing. You know how it is. Perks of the job. A client thing. I forced a smile, nodding as though that answer made any sense. But inside, something inside me hardened. He was lying. And if he was lying about this, what else was he hiding? From that moment on, I paid closer attention. I noted his late nights, the hurried phone calls, the way he seemed almost eager to leave the house. I started digging through bank records, finding more questionable transactions, expensive jewelry, shopping sprees, high-end hotels. Greg wasn't just being careless with money, he was spending it on someone else. Then, one evening, I caught a glimpse of his phone screen as he texted. "Can't wait to see the surprise you promised," the message read. The sender's name? Melanie. That was the final crack. The moment everything shattered. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't being paranoid. My husband wasn't just lying, he was betraying me in the most blatant, audacious way possible. And worse? He was using our money to do it. But if Greg thought he was getting away with it, he was wrong. I wasn't the type to sit back and let myself be played for a fool. No, I was going to make sure he regretted underestimating me. And I already knew exactly where to start. Once I knew the truth, there was no turning back. Greg had underestimated me. He thought I would cry, scream, maybe even beg for an explanation. He thought I would crumble under the weight of his betrayal, just another foolish wife, blind to her husband's deceit. But he was wrong. I had spent months silently gathering the pieces, and now it was time to put them together. The first step was information. If I wanted to dismantle his world, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Late at night, when Greg was asleep or conveniently working late, I pored over our financial records, tracing every purchase he had made. Expensive dinners, High-end shopping sprees, luxury hotel stays, each charge was a breadcrumb leading me to the bigger picture. And then there was the car, the ultimate insult. Purchased with our joint funds, yet titled solely in Greg's name. That was my way in. I started with the dealership. Posing as an inquisitive spouse looking for more information, I called them directly. My voice was warm, pleasant, friendly even. "I just have a few questions about a recent purchase," I said sweetly. "It's a big investment, you understand." It was almost too easy. By the time I hung up, I had everything I needed: transaction details, financial documents, even the timeline of when Greg had finalized the sale. He had made the down payment without my consent, and that little oversight was going to cost him everything. Next was the bank. "I believe my account has been compromised," I told the fraud department. "There's a transaction I don't recognize, and it's a significant amount." That got their attention. They flagged the account and launched an investigation. Now the noose was tightening, and Greg had no idea. In the meantime, I played my role to perfection. I laughed at his stupid jokes, nodded along as he rambled about his business trips, and even kissed him goodnight, all while knowing exactly where he had been. Every smirk he gave me as he secretly texted Melanie only fueled my resolve. He thought he was in control, that he had everything figured out. But the truth was, I was the one holding the strings now. I watched him closely, memorizing his routines, his habits. When he smirked at his phone, I knew he was texting her. When he came home smelling of cologne I didn't buy, I knew he had been with her. And when I caught a glimpse of a message from Melanie, "Can't wait to see the surprise you promised," I knew exactly what he was planning. Greg had orchestrated an entire charade. He was going to take me out for a luxurious anniversary dinner, smiling across the table as he pretended to be the perfect husband, all while waiting for the moment he could sneak away and present Melanie with her grand surprise. The car. But he didn't realize I had a surprise of my own. By the time the night arrived, everything was in place. The fraud report had triggered an official investigation, and the dealership had been notified. The repossession team was scheduled. Greg was about to experience the shock of his life, and he had no clue. I kept up the act, dressing up for our anniversary dinner as if nothing was wrong. When he handed me roses and kissed my cheek, I smiled. When he ordered the finest wine and had a pianist play our song, I let him enjoy his little performance. And when he glanced at his phone, his face lighting up at a message from Melanie, I simply raised my glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," I said. Greg thought the night was going exactly as planned. He had no idea his world was already crumbling. Greg was in his element that night, completely unaware that his perfect little world was already falling apart. Dressed in a sharp suit, he strolled into the house with an air of confidence, holding a bouquet of roses in one hand and a bottle of expensive champagne in the other. "Happy anniversary, babe," he said, flashing that same smug grin that had once made my heart flutter. I smiled back, but it wasn't the smile of a loving wife. It was the smile of a woman who knew she was about to burn everything he had built to the ground. "Happy anniversary," I replied sweetly, accepting the flowers with a practiced ease. My heart was pounding, not with love or excitement, but with the anticipation of watching his perfect deception unravel before his eyes. At dinner, Greg spared no expense. The finest wine, the most extravagant dishes, a pianist playing softly in the background, it was all meticulously planned, the perfect facade of a devoted husband treating his wife to a night she would never forget. And it was true, I wouldn't forget this night. But not for the reasons he imagined. Halfway through our meal, his phone buzzed. I watched him carefully as he glanced at the screen, the corners of his lips twitching upward before he quickly masked his excitement. Everything okay? I asked, tilting my head in feigned curiosity. Just a work thing, he replied, slipping his phone back into his pocket with a casual shrug. I knew exactly what the message said. Melanie was waiting. Waiting for the grand surprise he had promised her. The car. The car he had purchased with our money. I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring the moment. He had no idea that as he sat there, relishing in his little victory, his world was being ripped apart piece by piece. After dinner, Greg suggested we take a walk. It's such a beautiful night, he said, slipping his arm around my shoulders. I let him. I let him have these last few moments of bliss, before everything came crashing down. When we returned home, Greg was restless. I could see it in the way he kept glancing at his watch, tapping his fingers against the counter, checking his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. Finally, he cleared his throat. I've got to run out for a bit, he said, his tone carefully casual. Work emergency. On our anniversary? I asked, raising an innocent brow. It won't take long, he assured me, already reaching for his keys. I smiled. Of course. Don't let me keep you. He was out the door in seconds. And I poured myself another glass of wine and waited. It didn't take long. Barely an hour later, my phone buzzed. A message from Detective Ruiz. Repossession complete. Everything went as planned. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, gripping the phone so tightly my fingers ached. It was done. The car, Greg's ultimate symbol of betrayal, had been taken. And the best part? He had no idea yet. I could already picture the scene unfolding the moment Greg arrived at Melanie's, smug and self-assured, only to find the spot where the car should have been empty. The way his heart must have stopped, his confusion turning to panic as he called the dealership, only to be met with cold, official confirmation that the purchase had been flagged for fraud. And now, he would come home. Furious. Lost. Desperate. I settled onto the couch, my book open in my lap, though I wasn't reading. I was waiting. The front door slammed open. I didn't flinch. Greg stormed inside, his face flushed, his movements sharp and agitated. He tossed his keys onto the counter with more force than necessary, his breath uneven. Rough night? I asked, glancing up at him, my voice calm. He shot me a glare, but forced his tone into something more controlled. Just some unexpected complications. Oh? I feigned concern. Anything I can help with? No, he snapped, then quickly softened. I mean, it's fine. Nothing to worry about. I nodded slowly, biting back a smirk. I had just destroyed the foundation of his lies. And he had no idea that this was just the beginning. The first sign of Greg's unraveling came the morning after the repossession. He was pacing in the kitchen, his phone pressed tightly to his ear, his fingers running through his hair in frustration. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a frantic, barely contained panic. I don't care what it takes, he hissed into the phone. Just fix it. She's furious, and I can't. He stopped abruptly when he saw me standing in the doorway, coffee mug in hand. For a brief moment, his expression flickered with something guilt, suspicion, maybe even fear. Then, just as quickly, he masked it with a forced smile. Morning, I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Morning, he replied stiffly, his voice strained. Just handling some work stuff. Sounds stressful. I tilted my head, watching him closely. Anything I should know about? No, he said quickly, his jaw tightening. Nothing you need to worry about. I bit back a smirk and nodded, pretending to believe him. But I already knew what he was trying and failing to fix. The fraud report had triggered an official investigation. The dealership wasn't about to release the car without a full review, and Greg, despite all his smooth talking, couldn't charm his way out of it this time. The cracks in his composure grew more obvious with each passing day. He was constantly on his laptop, muttering under his breath, slamming the lid shut in frustration when things didn't go his way. He spent hours on the phone, arguing in hushed tones with someone, Melanie, no doubt trying to convince her that everything would be fine. One evening, I overheard one of their calls. I told you I'd fix it, Greg snapped, pacing the living room, his voice low but furious. Do you think I like this any more than you do? I stood just out of sight, listening. There's nothing I can do right now, he continued, his frustration mounting. These things happen. You need to stop overreacting. A pause. Melanie must have said something particularly scathing, because Greg ran a hand over his face and groaned. I said I'll handle it. Just give me some damn time. The call ended with a sharp beep, and Greg tossed his phone onto the couch, cursing under his breath. I stepped into the room, keeping my expression neutral. Everything okay? He stiffened, then forced a tight smile. Yeah. Just work stuff. Must be tough. I sat down across from him, watching as he clenched and unclenched his fists. You've been so stressed lately. Are you sure there's nothing I can do to help? He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. No. I've got it under control. But he didn't. That night, I received another update from Detective Ruiz. The investigation is moving forward. The dealership has corroborated the fraud report. Your husband's activity is under review. I stared at the message, a mix of relief and satisfaction washing over me. The net was closing in. Greg had spent years manipulating me, twisting the truth to suit his needs. But now? Now he was the one losing control. The next morning, his mood hit a new low. He sat at the kitchen table, hunched over his untouched coffee, staring at nothing. I don't know what's wrong with people these days, he muttered bitterly. Everyone's out for themselves. I almost choked on my coffee, but managed to keep my face neutral. Really? What happened? He waved a dismissive hand. Just setbacks. I hummed an acknowledgement, sipping my coffee slowly. That's too bad. By the end of the week, Greg was visibly unraveling. His usually competent demeanor was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to be grasping at straws. Every time his phone rang, his shoulders tensed. Every time he checked his email, his brow furrowed deeper. He was scrambling, and it was delicious to watch. One evening, as he sat in the living room typing furiously on his laptop, I leaned against the doorway. You know, Greg, I said casually, sometimes people get exactly what they deserve. His fingers froze over the keyboard. Slowly, he turned to look at me, his expression guarded. What's that supposed to mean? I shrugged, my face the picture of innocence. Just something to think about. Greg stared at me for a moment longer, as if searching for something in my expression. Then, without a word, he turned back to his laptop. He was starting to suspect. Good. Let him wonder. Let him squirm. He had no idea just how much further he had to fall. The first sign of Greg's unraveling came the morning after the repossession. He was pacing in the kitchen, his phone pressed tightly to his ear, his fingers running through his hair in frustration. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a frantic, barely contained panic. "I don't care what it takes," he hissed into the phone. "Just fix it. She's furious, and I can't." He stopped abruptly when he saw me standing in the doorway, coffee mug in hand. For a brief moment, his expression flickered with something: guilt, suspicion, maybe even fear. Then, just as quickly, he masked it with a forced smile. "Morning," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Morning," he replied stiffly, his voice strained. "Just handling some work stuff." "Sounds stressful." I tilted my head, watching him closely. "Anything I should know about?" "No," he said quickly, his jaw tightening. "Nothing you need to worry about." I bit back a smirk and nodded, pretending to believe him. But I already knew what he was trying, and failing, to fix. The fraud report had triggered an official investigation. The dealership wasn't about to release the car without a full review, and Greg, despite all his smooth talking, couldn't charm his way out of it this time. The cracks in his composure grew more obvious with each passing day. He was constantly on his laptop, muttering under his breath, slamming the lid shut in frustration when things didn't go his way. He spent hours on the phone, arguing in hushed tones with someone, Melanie, no doubt, trying to convince her that everything would be fine. One evening, I overheard one of their calls. "I told you I'd fix it," Greg snapped, pacing the living room, his voice low but furious. "Do you think I like this any more than you do?" I stood just out of sight, listening. "There's nothing I can do right now," he continued, his frustration mounting. "These things happen. You need to stop overreacting." A pause. Melanie must have said something particularly scathing, because Greg ran a hand over his face and groaned. I said I'll handle it. Just give me some damn time. The call ended with a sharp beep, and Greg tossed his phone onto the couch, cursing under his breath. I stepped into the room, keeping my expression neutral. "Everything okay?" He stiffened, then forced a tight smile. "Yeah. Just work stuff. Must be tough." I sat down across from him, watching as he clenched and unclenched his fists. "You've been so stressed lately. Are you sure there's nothing I can do to help?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "No. I've got it under control." But he didn't. That night, I received another update from Detective Ruiz. "The investigation is moving forward. The dealership has corroborated the fraud report. Your husband's activity is under review." I stared at the message, a mix of relief and satisfaction washing over me. The net was closing in. Greg had spent years manipulating me, twisting the truth to suit his needs. But now? Now he was the one losing control. The next morning, his mood hit a new low. He sat at the kitchen table, hunched over his untouched coffee, staring at nothing. "I don't know what's wrong with people these days," he muttered bitterly. "Everyone's out for themselves." I almost choked on my coffee, but managed to keep my face neutral. "Really? What happened?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Just setbacks." I hummed an acknowledgement, sipping my coffee slowly. That's too bad. By the end of the week, Greg was visibly unraveling. His usually competent demeanor was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to be grasping at straws. Every time his phone rang, his shoulders tensed. Every time he checked his email, his brow furrowed deeper. He was scrambling, and it was delicious to watch. One evening, as he sat in the living room typing furiously on his laptop, I leaned against the doorway. "You know, Greg," I said casually, "sometimes people get exactly what they deserve." His fingers froze over the keyboard. Slowly, he turned to look at me, his expression guarded. "What's that supposed to mean?" I shrugged, my face the picture of innocence. "Just something to think about." Greg stared at me for a moment longer, as if searching for something in my expression. Then, without a word, he turned back to his laptop. He was starting to suspect. Good. Let him wonder. Let him squirm. He had no idea just how much further he had to fall. Greg had been unraveling for days, but on that Saturday evening, he finally broke. I had been watching him closely, noting every sign of his growing desperation: the restless pacing, the hushed arguments on the phone, the frantic clicking of his laptop keys. He was a man grasping at the last shreds of control, clinging to the illusion that he could still fix what was already beyond repair. That night, I heard his phone buzz again. He glanced at the screen, cursed under his breath, and walked outside to take the call. I followed quietly, staying just out of sight by the open window. "You don't understand," Greg hissed, his voice low and frantic. "It's not my fault. The dealership is claiming fraud, but I didn't." A sharp pause. The person on the other end, Melanie, no doubt wasn't interested in his excuses. "I told you I'd fix it," he continued, his voice cracking under the weight of his frustration. "Do you think I like this any more than you do? Just give me a little more time." Melanie's response was muffled, but her anger was unmistakable. Greg let out a harsh sigh. "No, don't do this. I said I'd take care of it." Another pause. A long one. Then suddenly, Greg muttered a curse and ended the call with a sharp jab of his finger. He stormed back inside, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. I was already waiting in the living room, my laptop open in my lap. "Everything okay?" I asked, my tone light, as if I hadn't just heard every word of his desperate plea. "Fine," he snapped, running a hand through his hair. He disappeared into the bedroom. Moments later, I heard the unmistakable sound of drawers being yanked open and slammed shut. Curious, I walked to the doorway and leaned against the frame. Greg was frantically throwing clothes into a duffel bag, his movements hurried, erratic. "What are you doing?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "Packing," he said shortly, not even looking at me. "Packing?" I raised an eyebrow. "Are you going somewhere?" "Don't start, Holly," he muttered, shoving a handful of shirts into the bag. "I don't have time for this right now." I crossed my arms. "What's going on, Greg? You've been acting strange all week." He froze for just a second. Just long enough for me to catch the flicker of something in his expression: panic, guilt, defeat. Then he shook his head and forced out a tight, frustrated sigh. "It's nothing. Just a work emergency I need to deal with." I held his gaze, letting the silence stretch between us, thick and heavy. Finally, I smiled. "If you say so." Greg finished packing in tense silence. Then, Without another word, he grabbed his duffel bag and stormed out the door. The moment it closed behind him, I felt a rush of relief. Then, almost as if on cue, my phone buzzed. A message from Detective Ruiz. The investigation is moving fast. Expect more developments soon. I sat down on the couch, my fingers tightening around my phone. Greg thought he was running away to fix things, to salvage whatever was left. But the truth was, there was nothing left to fix. By the time he realized it, it would be far too late. The next morning, Monday morning, I woke up to a string of frantic voicemails from Greg. Holly, call me back. It's urgent. I need to talk to you now. They're saying fraud, but it's not true. You've got to help me fix this. I listened to each one, then deleted them without hesitation. Over coffee, I texted Detective Ruiz for an update. His reply was swift. Greg tried to contact the dealership this morning. He's panicking, but the fraud investigation has progressed too far for him to do anything. A slow, satisfied smile spread across my lips. By midday, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Greg stood on the porch, looking wrecked. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie askew, his usual arrogance completely gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression desperate. We need to talk, he said, his voice strained. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. Talk about what, Greg? The car you bought for your mistress? Or the fraud charges you're facing? His eyes widened, panic flickering across his face. Holly, I can explain. I shook my head. No need. I know everything. He stumbled over his words, struggling to form a defense, but I didn't give him the chance. You used our money to fund your lies, I said, my voice calm, steady. You betrayed me. And now, you're paying the price. Greg stepped closer, hands raised in surrender. Holly, please. I messed up, but we can fix this. I'll pay you back. I'll do whatever it takes. I raised an eyebrow. Pay me back? With what? Your empty promises? Or the love letters from Melanie? The mention of her name made him flinch. Before he could respond, I stepped aside and gestured to the stack of papers on the entryway table. You can start by signing these. Greg hesitated, glancing at the documents. What is this? Divorce papers, I said simply. You've already lost the car. Soon, you'll lose access to everything else. Consider this your final chance to walk away with whatever dignity you have left. He stared at me, his jaw clenching. For a moment, I thought he might argue. But then, his shoulders sagged in defeat. You don't have to do this, he whispered weakly. I held my ground. Yes, I do. Because unlike you, I know how to finish what I start. Greg left without another word. And as I closed the door behind him, I felt lighter than I had in years. The moment Greg walked out of that door for the last time, a strange silence settled over the house. But it wasn't the oppressive silence I had grown used to during our marriage, the kind that came with unspoken resentment, buried secrets, and the constant fear of confrontation. No, this silence was different. It was the kind of silence that signified freedom. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door he had just walked through, divorce papers still sitting on the table where he had reluctantly signed them. He had left without another word, His shoulders slumped in defeat, his once unwavering arrogance shattered. I took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, I felt light. The weight of his betrayal, the endless stress of pretending everything was fine, the suffocating facade of our marriage, it was all gone. Now, it was time to put my life back together. The first step was reclaiming my space. This house, which had once felt like ours, was now mine, and I was determined to make sure it reflected that. Amanda came over that weekend, armed with paint samples and a bottle of wine. "This place already feels different," she said as we rolled fresh coats of paint onto the walls. "It's like you've taken back the energy he drained from it." "That's the goal," I replied with a smile. Greg had always dictated how our home should look. Sleek, modern, impersonal, exactly like him. But now, I was filling it with my personality. Soft blue walls replaced the cold grays he had insisted on. The furniture he had picked out was gone, replaced by pieces I actually loved. His office? I turned it into an art studio, something I had dreamed of for years but had never been allowed to have. It felt good. It felt right. Greg had spent years making me believe that my ambitions were secondary to his. Every time I talked about advancing my career, he dismissed it with, "You don't need to stress about work, babe. I'm taking care of us." But now, I was taking care of myself. I reached out to old colleagues and mentors, letting them know I was ready to get back into the industry. Their responses were overwhelming: messages of support, job opportunities, connections. Within weeks, I had consulting offers lined up, and for the first time in years, I felt excited about my work. One evening, I got a call from a former boss. "We'd love to have you back," she said warmly. "No pressure, but if you're ready, there's a position waiting for you." I smiled, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. "Thank you," I said. "I'm ready." The investigation against Greg continued moving forward, and I received regular updates from Detective Ruiz. "The dealership is fully cooperating," he told me in one call. Greg's attempts to cover his tracks only made things worse for him. "It's just a matter of time." I thanked him, but honestly, I had already moved on. Greg's downfall was no longer my concern. His choices, his mistakes, his consequences, they were his to bear. One evening, as I stood in my newly decorated living room, I noticed a framed photo on the mantel. It was a picture of me and Amanda from years ago, taken before Greg had entered my life. Looking at it now, I realized something important: I was still that woman. The strong, independent woman who knew how to stand on her own. Greg hadn't taken that from me. And now, I was free. The days following Greg's departure were quiet, but not in the heavy, suffocating way they had been during our marriage. This silence was different. It was peaceful, freeing, full of possibility. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the next lie to unravel, or for the next betrayal to surface. Greg was gone. His name was still lingering in legal paperwork, his mistakes still making their way through fraud investigations, but in every way that mattered, he was no longer a part of my life. And that meant one thing: I could finally start living for myself. I had spent so long putting Greg's ambitions above my own that I had forgotten what it was like to dream for myself. So, one morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and wrote down a list. Things I've always wanted to do: redecorate the house, travel to Greece, start my own business, spend more time with friends and family. I let the list grow naturally, without limitations. These weren't just wishes, they were plans. And for the first time in a long time, nothing was holding me back. The first item was already in progress. My house, the place that once felt like ours, but had always been controlled by him, was becoming my sanctuary. Amanda helped me transform it, one room at a time, replacing Greg's sterile, modern choices with warmth and personality. His cold gray walls were now a soft shade of blue, his carefully curated furniture was swapped for cozy, inviting pieces that felt like me. "It's like you've erased every trace of him," Amanda said one evening as we put up new curtains. I smiled. "That's the idea." With my personal life finally under my control, it was time to focus on something I had abandoned: my career. Greg had spent years convincing me that my work didn't matter as much as his, that his job was the priority, that I didn't need to stress about my own ambitions because he was taking care of us. But he had only ever taken care of himself. So I reached out to old colleagues and mentors, and their response was overwhelming. Within weeks, I had consulting offers and potential career opportunities lined up. My confidence, which Greg had spent years slowly chipping away at, came back with each conversation, each email, each new possibility. Then, one evening, I got a call from a former boss. "We'd love to have you on board for this project," she said warmly. "No pressure, but if you're ready, the position is yours." I smiled, feeling something I hadn't in years: pride. "I'm ready," I told her. For years, I had dreamed of visiting Greece. Greg had always promised, "One day, babe. We'll go when the timing's right." The timing had never been right for him. But now? It was perfect for me. So I booked the ticket. A solo trip, just for me. The thought of walking along sunlit beaches, exploring ancient ruins, and rediscovering myself in a place untouched by memories of Greg filled me with a sense of adventure I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a vacation, it was a statement. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. Greg's story, however, wasn't quite over. One afternoon, I got a call from Detective Ruiz. "The fraud investigation is officially complete," he said. "Greg has been formally charged, and the case will proceed to court in a few months." I felt an unexpected mix of emotions: relief, validation, and a quiet satisfaction. Greg had spent years manipulating me, using me, taking advantage of my trust. But in the end, he had outsmarted himself. "Justice takes time," Ruiz added, "but it's worth it." I thanked him, knowing I no longer needed to follow every update. Greg's fate was no longer my concern. That evening, Amanda came over with takeout and wine. "You look different," she said, studying me. I laughed. "What, like I lost 100 pounds?" She grinned. "Like a weight's been lifted." I took a sip of wine, savoring the moment. Maybe it has. Greg's charges were moving forward, my divorce was nearly finalized, and for the first time in a long time, my future felt like mine. "So, what's next?" Amanda asked. I gestured toward my notebook, the list of dreams that had once felt so out of reach. "I've been making plans," I said. "Travel, work, maybe even starting my own business. I'm finally figuring out what I want, instead of what someone else expects of me." Amanda raised her glass in a toast. "Here's to the next chapter." And as I clinked my glass against hers, I realized this was just the beginning.